I'm transgender. But what does that even mean? To describe being transgender, I'm going to have to digress a bit and talk about what gender is at all. And sorry to the trans people in the audience, I know there's some of you here. This is going to be a lot of stuff you already know and live every day. But please stay with me, because there is some hope at the end. Gender is a different spelling of the French word genre, and it simply means category or label. It was first used as a term to describe the arbitrary categorization of nouns into two or more groups in various languages. And by extension, it was later used to describe a broad categorization of people into two groups, female and male. These two groups are based on a kind of mythical natural order of things, based originally on people's ability to make biological children together, but it's since been extended to almost every aspect of everyday life. Gender disparities in our society are real. Women are expected to do more or better work for the same pay. They're much more likely to be objectified, harassed, and abused. And they're frequently denied access to opportunities that men have. In this way, the marginalization and oppression of women is similar to other arbitrary, unfair categorizations of our species, such as race and class. But whereas a liberal society, we recognize that racial segregation is offensive and sets back the progress of race equality, we're still apparently happy with gender segregation everywhere. Toilets in public spaces are divided by gender. Clothes shops and even pharmacies are divided by gender. Athletes are divided into groupings based on their gender rather than their relative ability. Some schools still have different uniforms or different classes divided up by the gender of their students. We still describe romantic relationships as being heterosexual or homosexual, but we wouldn't dream of using a label like interracial. We still have gendered parties to celebrate upcoming weddings. We still proudly reveal the gender assignment of our new children. The names and pronouns that we use in everyday conversation in English hint to others which gender we have been assigned into. Even shopping for gifts online will often ask you as the first question whether the gift is for him or for her, as if a man could never enjoy a bubble bath, or a woman wouldn't like a power drill. Gender is segregation, and along with religion, it is one of the last state-sponsored forms of segregation. Some people who grow up in this world are going to feel out of place because they have been placed in the wrong category. This is absolutely a factor of this everyday arbitrary categorization that has been permitted in society. A strong emotion that we feel that we've been placed into a category that actively causes us harm. And that's what we mean when we talk about gender dysphoria. Some of those of us who experience gender dysphoria will find ourselves neatly fitting into the other box than the one we were assigned at birth. Many of us will find the other box just as restrictive and will want to live somewhere partially inside, between, or completely away from these arbitrary labels. Being trans is awesome. Up until the age of 35, I had no idea why I felt so out of place in society. No matter what I did to my appearance, nothing looked or felt like me. Whenever I was invited to take part in activities, like the ones I described that had a gendered element to them, or people used gendered language to describe me or talk about me, I felt a kind of pain that I shrugged off because none of it made any sense to me. Then I tried on some clothes that felt more like me. I made more trans friends. I opted out of anything that was gendered with my birth assignment. I started attending Pride as a part of the community and not as an ally. I asked people to start using they, them pronouns for me. With every one of these little steps, I felt the pain of gender dysphoria fading. And gradually I realized that I had spent 3.5 decades not being myself, hiding inside a shell of a gender that society had forced onto me. My life is infinitely more fulfilling now that I have the power of being able to live as my true gender identity, or at least as some part of it. I'm still not sure how I feel about the word woman to describe myself, but I know that it and female-coded language don't hurt me the way that those other terms did. For now, I like the term non-binary because it just says what I am not. Every trans experience is different. but I'll try to describe how it feels for me. This is just for me. The best description is that it's like living life without a big sign around my neck telling people that I am someone that I am not. And that means that I have so much more freedom to live my true, authentic life. But then, living in the UK right now as a trans person is really hard. I say every trans experience is different, but I have dozens of trans friends, and I don't know anyone who would disagree with that statement. In 2018, the Theresa May government launched a consultation on modernizing the Gender Recognition Act. It was quite innocuous legislation that only really related to making a complex legal process simpler, but it contained this term, self-identification. This term, taken completely out of context, was all that powerful single interest groups needed to start a campaign that they have been waging since then in the press and in the courts. That was 8 years ago? 7 years ago? The trick they found was to disguise transphobia as feminism, to claim that trans people's rights stand in opposition to women's rights, and to convince enough people within the women's rights movement that we were a threat, while everyone else in that movement would come out in support of us, creating a split and infighting within the feminist movement. Identifying celebrities who would endorse this view was an early tactic. The figureheads were first Graham Linehan, remember him? And then latterly, J.K. Rowling. There are numerous arguments put forward by this movement, all of which have been thoroughly debunked many times over, but they still get repeated as though they are common sense. And this is the boring bit. These include that abusive men will self-identify as trans just to get access to women's spaces. Nothing about this argument explains what is stopping abusive men getting access to women's spaces now, and why they would need to identify as trans to do it. And these arguments always completely ignore the existence of trans men and other transmasculine people. Any enforceable bathroom ban would just increase the number of visible men in women's spaces. The argument that trans women are biological men and vice versa, this is based on a GCSE level understanding of biology and has been refuted repeatedly by the biology community, and nevertheless ignores the fact that our brains are part of our biology. The argument that schools are turning children trans, or that children are being medically transitioned before they're old enough to understand, this is a misrepresentation of the larger number of kids who can come to terms with their gender identity as children now that schools are permitted to talk about it. They weren't in my day. And about a medical technology that allows kids to delay puberty until they're old enough to be sure that it's the right one for them. That trans women somehow have an unfair advantage in women's sports, despite there being no evidence that trans women are regularly winning anything. And the one study done on this finding the exact opposite to be true. That any one specific trans woman who has committed a horrific crime is somehow representative of the whole trans community, when the evidence shows that trans women are no more likely to commit violent crime than cis women. And cis is a word that means not trans, if that's not a word you didn't know. But trans women are no more likely to commit violent crime than cis women, and they are indeed much more likely to be a victim of violent crime. And all of their arguments are predicated on this idea that a strict separation of the genders in many aspects of public life is a good thing. Something that feminists have argued against for centuries. These attacks have now started to hurt us in the courts and in guidance produced by the non-parliamentary body that was set up to enforce the Equality Act. It's looking more and more likely that trans people will be forced into boxes corresponding to our sex observed at birth instead of where we know we belong. We are not being invited to the table to discuss this. Oh, thanks for inviting me. The tiny, well-funded interest groups get meetings with, like, the health minister. They get invited to give evidence in court. They get quoted in newspaper stories. But we, as many as 1% of the UK population, the very group that these fights are meant to be about, are talked about as though we are incapable of standing up for ourselves or presenting our perspectives at these tables. And these groups are tiny interest groups. You can tell this when there are protests in support of trans rights. This year's Trans Pride London attracted a crowd of 100,000 supporters. That's more than 1 in every 1,000 people who live in the UK were there at Trans Pride London. Whereas the picket groups that protest trans rights at every Pride are typically made up of the same 30 to 100 people who travel around the country just to protest us. A 2021 hearing in the European Parliament found that this movement is funded primarily by the so-called Christian right in the USA and in Europe, and by oligarchs in Russia. Both groups have an interest in destabilizing feminism and destabilizing democracy. The former, because having weakened women's rights movements makes it easier to legislate their bodily autonomy. Unitarians have always been there to fight prejudice and segregation. We remember the campaign, Am I Not a Man and a Brother, started by Josiah Wedgwood to promote the abolition of the slave trade. We remember Mary Wollstonecraft in the UK and Judith Sargent Murray in the USA, founders of the modern feminist movement. We remember James Reeb and Viola Lutzow, who were murdered by white supremacists in the USA for fighting segregation in the 1960s. And we remember the acts of countless Unitarians in recent times who have stood up for the rights of migrants, of Muslims, of homeless people, and of disabled people when councils and governments have come after them. Cross Street Chapel itself started as a secret meeting. Early Unitarians were forced into hiding because our revelation, what we knew to be untrue about the society of the time, was deemed radical and dangerous, the way that trans people are today. Many of the battles above are still ongoing, but trans rights is the latest issue gripping the press. Every week, there is another headline article in the Sunday Telegraph demonizing us, and many other papers and news sources have a similar track record of blaming us for everything, the same way that they did with Muslims in the 2 decades before. I heard a statistic that, on average, the British press currently publishes 16 articles a day about trans people, almost all of them hostile to us. What chance do we have? As Unitarians, we are free to practice religion however we like. Great. But we are also Unitarians because we want to learn from others and do what we can to make the world freer and more tolerant. I hope I've convinced you that your voice is necessary. Here are some things you can do to support trans rights. You can spot the rhetoric and help to debunk it. Although people working for these interest groups rely on fear rather than logic, some of the more neutral people that they're trying to convince will understand when the rhetoric is debunked. I've lost count of the number of people who, when you tell them they're worried about, they say they're worried about trans women in sports, and you say, when was the last time a trans woman won anything? And they go, oh, yeah. You can advocate for more gender neutrality in our society. This gender neutrality benefits everyone. So many of these arguments are predicated on the idea that gender segregation is a good thing, when in the majority of cases, everyone has a better time if we don't segregate people by gender. For example, toilets have for years had the technology to deliver self-contained cubicles with their own washing facilities. Making those segregated by gender is nonsense, since every person is always in the toilet by themselves anyway. Similarly, segregating things like razors based on gender benefits no one. Surely it's easier and more accurate to say face razor or leg razor. Recognize that where gender spaces exist, and for some purposes they must exist, in the majority of cases, people need to be able to self-select into them. Saying that the women's floor of a department store is only for women is saying that those clothes are completely off limits to anyone who doesn't fit your definition of what a woman is. This is how we handle religious freedom in this country too. No one is ever asked to prove that they're a specific religion to gain access to ritual washing facilities, for example. You can write to your MP. There are loads of good guides out there about what to say by Transactual and others. The only group who can actually change the law, like forget the Supreme Court, forget the EHRC, the only group who can actually change the law for everyone is Parliament. And so your MP needs to know that you support us and you reject the rolling back of our rights. You could also donate money to Victoria MacLeod, Britain's first trans woman judge, as she takes this fight to the European Court of Human Rights. She needs as much money as possible to win that battle, and trans people have won in that court before. Talk to your friends about this issue. Too many people are silent because it seems too complicated. But the more that supporters of trans rights talk about it, the more our voices will be impossible to ignore alongside the very, very loud voices of those who oppose us. And my top advice would be, make more trans friends. Every trans person has a different story. Some might even disagree with everything that I've said here today. Having us in your friendship groups helps people to realize that we are just the same as everybody else. Our lives are not about being trans. We have loves, interests, jobs, hobbies, just like everyone else. We're people. And to the trans and non-binary people in the congregation here today, remember that we will overcome this eventually. The vast majority of society is on our side, and this has never been more evident than when 100,000 people showed up to Trans Pride. All of these arguments were made about gay people before they were made about us. And now, we live in a country where it's completely socially unacceptable to be homophobic. The same will be true of our rights one day. Remember, we have allies. We don't need to fight this by ourselves. Remember that all the major human rights charities are on our side, that the UN is on our side, that our friends and our families are on our side. It's a dark time now, and many individuals will suffer, but as a community, we will thrive. Thanks for listening.